Winter, 1933. A photographer stands at the corner of 5th Avenue and 50th Street, camera raised toward limestone that has not yet finished settling. The building in front of him, 70 floors of Indiana stone and steel, still trailing construction scaffolding along its northern face, catches the February light in a way that seems almost aggressive, as if daring the gray city below to find fault. 6 blocks south, a bread line stretches past St. Patrick's Cathedral. Here, stonemasons are still mortaring the facades of what John D. Rockefeller Jr. has called, in a private letter now held at the Rockefeller Archive Center in Sleepy Hollow, the most important thing I will ever attempt. He wrote those words in 1930, when the Metropolitan Opera had already abandoned him, the stock market had already collapsed, and 72 buildings were already rubble. He built it anyway. Some monuments are not built from confidence. Some are built from the terror of stopping. There is a document in the Columbia University archives that does not look like the beginning of anything. It is a ground lease, executed in 1928, transferring control of 12 acres of Midtown Manhattan real estate, bounded by West 48th and West 51st Streets, running from 5th Avenue to 6th, to John D. Rockefeller Jr., for an annual rent of $3,300,000, binding for 24 years. The paper is formal, dry, bureaucratic in the way that only documents containing life-altering obligations can be. There are no grand proclamations in its language. There is no vision stated. There is only an agreement signed by men who believed they were brokering a cultural campus for the Metropolitan Opera, and one man who had not yet understood how completely the world was about to change beneath him. John D. Rockefeller Jr. was not his father. This is the fact that animated every decision he made, and it is the fact that makes Rockefeller Center legible as a human project rather than merely an architectural one. John D. Rockefeller Sr. had built an empire in oil, had become the wealthiest private citizen in American history, and had spent the final decades of his life distributing his fortune in ways that could not quite outrun his reputation. The son inherited the money and the name, and with them a particular kind of pressure, the pressure of a man who has been given everything except the defining act that would make the inheritance his own. He had funded restoration projects, donated to universities, financed the reconstruction of colonial Williamsburg. These were the gestures of a steward, not a creator. The Columbia lease, initially conceived as a site for a new Metropolitan Opera House surrounded by commercial buildings whose rents would subsidize the opera's programming, offered something different. It offered the possibility of authorship. Rockefeller did not retreat. His private correspondence from this period, preserved at the Rockefeller Archive Center, reveals a man who processed his anxiety through a language of obligation, not optimism, but duty. He wrote to his advisors that he had entered the lease in good faith and would honor it in good faith. He wrote that he saw no alternative to proceeding. What the letters do not contain is enthusiasm. There is no rhetoric of visionary ambition in the documents from 1929 and 1930. There is instead the controlled, slightly airless prose of a man who has committed himself to something and has decided that the commitment itself is the only honorable position remaining. Whether this constitutes courage or a more complex form of self-preservation, the decision to build rather than face the particular shame of a Rockefeller who folded is a question the archive cannot answer. It can only show the letters. The letters show a man who kept moving. What he committed to building was not a cultural campus, but a commercial real estate complex, the largest privately funded construction project in American history, designed to generate sufficient rental income to cover the Columbia ground lease, and eventually return a profit on a capital investment that would ultimately exceed $100 million. The site surveys conducted in 1928 and 1929 documented what stood on those 12 acres before construction. 228 existing structures, ranging from brownstone tenements to small commercial buildings to at least one speakeasy operating behind a convincing facade of respectability. More than 4,000 residents and business tenants occupied the site. These were not, for the most part, people with resources sufficient to resist displacement. They were the ordinary inhabitants of an ordinary urban block. Working-class families, small shopkeepers, the kinds of people whose addresses are preserved only in demolition logs and tenant relocation records rather than in the histories that get written later. The site surveys mapped their buildings with technical precision and no editorial comment. A survey is not a moral document, but the act of reading those surveys in sequence, building after building cataloged, measured, and marked for demolition, produces a cumulative weight that the project's official histories tend to elide. Rockefeller Center was not built on empty land. It was built on the archaeology of other people's ordinary lives, cleared to make space for a monument that would be celebrated for its public generosity. The bread lines forming on Fifth Avenue in the winter of 1930 were not an ironic backdrop to the project. They were its context, its condition, the world inside which every decision about the complex was made. Rockefeller understood this. His public relations operation worked carefully to frame the construction project as depression relief, an employer of tens of thousands of workers at a moment of catastrophic unemployment. The framing was not false. It was also not complete. The lease that started everything renewed automatically. Columbia collected its rent through the Depression, through the war, through the post-war boom for 24 years and then beyond, on terms that had been fixed in a more confident era. Rockefeller had bound himself to those terms, and the complex he built to honor them became, in time, one of the most recognizable collections of buildings in the world. Whether it should have been built, whether a 12-acre displacement of 4,000 people executed during the worst economic catastrophe in American history, financed by inherited oil money, and designed primarily to service one man's need to escape his father's shadow, constitutes a legitimate claim on the phrase great architecture, is precisely the question that the complex beauty makes so difficult to answer cleanly. The Metropolitan Opera left. The Depression arrived. Rockefeller stayed. And Manhattan has never recovered from the fact that he did. Raymond Hood died in August of 1934 at the age of 53, from what his physicians described as complications of rheumatoid arthritis. The complex he had spent 5 years designing would not officially open until 1935. He never saw the completed thing. This biographical detail is routinely noted in architectural histories of Rockefeller Center, typically in a tone of mild melancholy, as a footnote to the building's triumph. It deserves more than that. Hood was the closest thing the project had to a genuine creative intelligence, a man with specific aesthetic convictions, real architectural arguments, and the professional confidence to advance them against a patron whose controlling instincts shaped every dimension of the design process. That he died before the work was complete is not merely sad. It is structurally appropriate in the way that architectural history occasionally produces an irony so precise it seems almost composed. The design process for Rockefeller Center was, from its beginning, an exercise in managed ambiguity. Rockefeller assembled what he called the Associated Architects, a consortium of 3 firms, Hood, Godley, and Feuilleux, Reinhardt and Hofmeister, and Corbett, Harrison, and McMurray, operating under a collaborative structure that deliberately diffused individual credit while preserving Rockefeller's ultimate authority over every significant decision. The arrangement had a practical justification. No single firm had sufficient personnel to design and supervise a complex of this scale simultaneously. But it also served a less practical function. By distributing design credit across 3 firms, Rockefeller ensured that no architect could claim the complex as his own. that the building would be remembered primarily as a Rockefeller project rather than a Hood project or a Harrison project, and that the patron's identity would remain inseparable from the work in a way that a traditional client-architect relationship might not guarantee. Hood understood this dynamic and appears to have accepted it, at least outwardly, with the pragmatism of a man who recognized that the commission was simply too significant to refuse on principle. His internal memos, a selection of which survive in the Avery Architectural and Fine Arts Library at Columbia University, show a designer navigating the particular difficulty of consortium work, the need to advocate for coherent design decisions across a group of equals who were not quite equal, in service of a client who was not quite a collaborator. Hood's primary architectural argument, advanced consistently through the design development process, was for unified vertical expression. He believed the complex should read as a single composition rather than a collection of individual buildings, and he pushed for the setback geometry of the central slab, what would become 30 Rockefeller Plaza, to dominate the ensemble with sufficient authority that the surrounding lower buildings would function as its base rather than as competing elements. Harvey Wiley Corbett argued differently. Corbett was drawn to the European tradition of the formal urban plaza, the public square organized around civic institutions, and he pushed for design solutions that would privilege the pedestrian experience at street level over the vertical drama of the tower. The tension between these positions, Hood's verticality versus Corbett's horizontality, the tower versus the promenade, was never fully resolved. What emerged from the consortium process was a hybrid that carries the marks of its contested origins. A dominant central tower, whose height and mass are undeniable, surrounded by lower structures whose relationship to the street is mediated by a promenade, the Channel Gardens, that runs from Fifth Avenue toward the tower's base and constitutes, depending on your interpretation, either a masterpiece of urban design or the world's most sophisticated retail corridor. Art Deco was not the architect's first or most passionately held choice. The style emerged from the design process as a pragmatic compromise between competing aesthetic ambitions and the more pressing constraint of investor palatability. Depression-era New York required a certain visual register from its major buildings, something that communicated confidence without ostentation, modernity without alienation, forward momentum without the provocation of genuine architectural radicalism. Art Deco provided this register, its vocabulary of stylized ornament, vertical emphasis, and heroic imagery, eagles, human figures in attitudes of industrial triumph, mathematical patterns rendered in relief, translated readily into the iconography of American optimism that Rockefeller's public relations apparatus was simultaneously deploying in its messaging about the project. The style was chosen, in other words, not because Hood or Corbett or Wallace Harrison loved it most, but because it said the right things to the right people at the right moment in history. Style as argument, ornament as reassurance. Hood's most personal contribution to the design, the proposal for rooftop gardens atop the complex lower buildings, was eventually realized, though in a form somewhat reduced from his original vision. The gardens exist today, largely invisible from street level, accessible only to building tenants and occasional organized tours. They are, in this sense, a precise physical metaphor for Hood's role in the project, real, thoughtful, skillfully executed, and almost entirely unknown. His Channel Gardens promenade sketches, among the earliest design documents for the complex, show a space conceived explicitly as democratic breathing room, a public amenity inserted into a commercial project as a kind of architectural conscience, limestone formalized into generosity. Whether the finished promenade honored this intention or inverted it, transforming the democratic gesture into a funnel directing pedestrian traffic toward the lobby of the RCA building, is a question that later critics would ask with considerable force, and that Hood was not alive to answer. 3 architects, 1 patron, 5 years. A building that opened the year after the man most responsible for its character died, and that proceeded to be celebrated primarily as a monument to the man who paid for it. The Associated Architects structure accomplished exactly what it was designed to accomplish. It is not an arrangement that reflects well on anyone involved. It is, however, an arrangement that produced one of the most significant urban complexes in American architectural history, which may be the most honest thing you can say about how great buildings actually get built. The first building to fall was a brownstone on West 48th Street, whose occupants had been given 60 days' notice in the spring of 1930. By the summer of that year, the demolition crews had worked their way through the southern third of the site, and the rubble, brick, timber, plaster, the physical material of other people's domestic arrangements, was being carted away in a continuous procession of trucks that moved east toward the river, making room for the survey stakes and excavation equipment that would follow. Charles O. Haight, the real estate manager who served as Rockefeller's operational executor for the site clearance, kept detailed logs of the demolition process. Those logs, now held in the Rockefeller Archive Center, are models of administrative thoroughness. They record square footage, structural condition, demolition costs per building, and the status of tenant relocations with the clean efficiency of a man whose job it was to convert inhabited space into construction site as smoothly and quickly as possible. What they do not record, because it was not Haight's job to record it, is what the displacement felt like to the 4,000 people being moved. This is not a criticism of Haight specifically. He was managing a legal and logistical operation of considerable complexity, and there is no evidence that he conducted it with unusual cruelty or indifference. Tenant relocation assistance was provided, though the records suggest it was calibrated to minimum legal obligation rather than genuine rehousing support. The people who left were given what they were legally owed, and then the buildings they had lived in were converted into rubble, and the rubble was removed, and the site was made ready for something that its builders believed would be incomparably more significant than what it replaced. This is how cities are rebuilt. It has always been how cities are rebuilt. The mechanism is not unique to Rockefeller Center. What is perhaps slightly unusual is the speed and completeness with which the prior history of the site was erased, not just physically, through demolition, but rhetorically, through the construction of a historical narrative in which the complex appeared to rise from nothing, a monument without a prior world beneath it. The demolition proceeded through the winter of 1930 and into 1931, the 30 and into 1931. The breadline winter, the winter in which unemployment in New York City would pass 20%, and the lines outside the municipal relief offices on Lower Broadway would stretch around the block before dawn. Rockefeller's public relations team was attentive to the optics. Press releases emphasized the construction workforce that would follow demolition. The carpenters, steel workers, electricians, and laborers who would eventually number approximately 75,000 workers at the project's employment peak, a figure that represented meaningful Depression-era relief and that was deployed in newspaper coverage with careful frequency. The framing was accurate in its arithmetic. 75,000 workers did work on the complex during its construction period. The framing was incomplete in its context. Those workers arrived after the 4,000 residents had already left, after the small businesses had already closed, after the speakeasies and tailor shops and boarding houses had already been converted into the rubble in Haight's logs. By the spring of 1931, the excavation was complete, and the structural steelwork had begun. The limestone facades that would eventually clad the complex's exterior were being quarried in Indiana, from the same geological formation, and in some cases from the same quarries, that were simultaneously supplying the Empire State Building, which was rising a mile south on 34th Street in what amounted to the most concentrated burst of major architectural construction in Manhattan's history. The year's two buildings were in direct competition for materials, for skilled labor, for media attention, and for the symbolic title of definitive New York monument. The Empire State Building would win the height competition, 102 floors against Rockefeller Center's maximum of 70, and would be completed first, opening in May of 1931. But the Empire State Building was, in its essential nature, a single tower, spectacular, iconic, and largely uninhabited for most of its early years, a trophy whose primary function was symbolic. Rockefeller Center was something more complicated and arguably more interesting, a complex of 19 buildings organized around a coherent urban vision designed to function as an integrated commercial ecosystem, its ambition measured not in height, but in density and breadth. 40,000 tons of structural steel, limestone transported from Indiana quarries by rail, 72 buildings demolished over 2 years. The math of the project's construction, the quantities of material, the numbers of workers, the scale of capital deployed in the depths of the Depression, has been rehearsed so many times in the histories of the complex that it has acquired a slightly numbing quality, the way very large numbers eventually cease to register as measurements of anything real. What the numbers cannot capture is the texture of the site during the construction period, the way Midtown Manhattan would have looked and sounded in the winter of 1932, with the steel skeleton of 30 Rockefeller Plaza rising against a sky that the surrounding buildings had not yet learned to frame, the construction lights burning through the night shift, the pneumatic hammers audible from Fifth Avenue, and the Channel Gardens, Hood's Promenade, Corbett's European gesture, Rockefeller's calculated civic grace note, still existing only as lines on drawings in the consortium's offices on West 55th Street. The limestone facades caught the winter light differently in 1932 than they do now. Something about the air, perhaps. Coal smoke and anxiety mixing into a particular gray that photographers of the period captured without trying. The first completed buildings of Rockefeller Center rose into that air carrying a visual language that had been chosen as carefully as a political speech. Art Deco was not merely a style, it was an argument. And the men who commissioned it understood precisely what they were arguing for. The official brief handed to the complex art program in 1932 contained a phrase that should have embarrassed someone: New Frontiers and the March of Civilization. It did not embarrass anyone. The brief was circulated, approved, and executed with the full conviction of men who believed that bronze and limestone could narrate history forward, that a building program could aesthetically insist that things were going to be all right. Gaston Lachaise, Paul, Manship, and José María Sert received their commissions within this framework, each assigned a portion of the visual mythology that Rockefeller and his advisors wanted installed permanently in the public imagination. Manship's gilded Prometheus arrived at the sunken plaza in 1934, descending toward the skating rink on a trajectory that the sculptor described as liberation, but that the patron understood as something more useful, aspiration made permanent, frozen mid-flight above a space where ordinary people ate lunch. Manship's Prometheus was not incidentally chosen. The figure, fire-bearer, transgressor, benefactor of humanity, mapped neatly onto the self-image Rockefeller wanted the complex to project. Here was the man who brought warmth to a cold world, who risked punishment to illuminate the darkness. That this mythology happened to coincide with the image of a wealthy industrialist underwriting construction during a depression was not, one suspects, accidental. The sculpture functions as corporate heraldry disguised as classical reference. It remains one of the most photographed objects in New York City, which suggests that the strategy worked in ways that even its commissioners might not have fully anticipated. Most people photographing Prometheus today could not name the artist, cannot identify the mythological figure, and do not know what he is descending toward. They know only that the image is powerful, that gold against limestone against winter sky produces something that feels important. This is what successful propaganda feels like from the inside, not coercive, but inevitable. Lachaise contributed allegorical limestone panels to the facades, figures of industry and intellect rendered in the flattened, angular style that Deco borrowed from Cubism and smoothed into optimism. Sert covered walls with sepia-toned murals that depicted the advance of human progress through machinery and collective labor. Imagery that was, in its own way, as ideologically charged as anything Rivera would later refuse to remove. The difference was that Sert's murals advanced no specific political argument. They celebrated effort in the abstract, labor as noble process divorced from any specific laborer, progress as an aesthetic condition rather than a historical one. This was the genius of the program's conservatism. It looked ambitious while committing to nothing. Art Deco's Depression-era function was not decoration. It was the visual proof that the system was still operating, that American capitalism could still produce beauty, that the men at the top still believed in the future enough to ornament it. Every facade was a rebuttal to the breadlines 6 blocks east on Fifth Avenue. The philosophical problem with beauty as argument is that it is very difficult to disagree with. You can reject a political pamphlet. You can dismiss a speech. You cannot easily reject a gilded bronze figure descending through winter. Light over a fountain whose proportions were calculated to make you feel small in a way that felt, somehow, like freedom. Rockefeller Center's art program understood something that advertising would spend the next century trying to systematize. Emotional experience bypasses critical resistance. Sert's murals replaced a destroyed Rivera. The replacement was deliberately inoffensive, aesthetically competent, and philosophically vacant. Nobody has written 500 words about Sert's murals. The empty wall they cover has generated more commentary than Sert ever will. This is the paradox at the center of the program. The art that survives in cultural memory is the art that was destroyed, and the art that was commissioned to be remembered has been, for the most part, forgotten. Style as propaganda requires that the propaganda go unnoticed. Rockefeller Center's art program succeeded so thoroughly that most visitors experience it as atmosphere rather than argument, which was, of course, exactly the intention. The sketch that Diego Rivera submitted in the spring of 1932 was approved by Nelson Rockefeller personally. This fact matters more than almost anything else in the story that follows, because what came after is so frequently narrated as inevitable, as though a Mexican communist muralist and an American capitalist heir were always going to end in destruction, when the truth is that it began in agreement. Rivera's preliminary design for the lobby mural of the RCA building showed a central figure at the controls of some vast machine, surrounded by imagery of workers and microbes and stars, a cosmological vision of human possibility rendered in Rivera's monumental style. Nelson wrote him a letter of approval. The contract was signed. Rivera traveled to New York. The figure at the center of the mural's final composition bore a recognizable face. Rivera had placed Vladimir Lenin into the image, not hidden, not symbolic, but present, identifiable, linking hands with workers of different nationalities in a gesture of international solidarity. Rivera had not submitted this specific element for prior approval. Whether this was tactical provocation or artistic conviction or some mixture of both has been debated for 90 years without resolution. What is documented is the letter Nelson Rockefeller sent in May of 1933, polite, pained, asking Rivera to replace Lenin's portrait with the face of some unknown man. Rivera's response was equally polite and equally firm. He offered to balance Lenin with a portrait of Abraham Lincoln. He offered to add other figures. He would not remove Lenin. The mural was Lenin or nothing. The construction of what followed was careful. Rivera continued working while negotiations stalled. Workers continued assisting him. On the evening of May 9, 1933, with the mural approximately 80% complete, a Rockefeller manager named Captain Timothy Donahue approached Rivera on the scaffold and handed him a check for the full contracted amount, $14,000, and asked him to leave the building. Rivera left. The fresco was immediately covered in brown paper. A security detail was posted. Photographers were not permitted to approach. The mural that had generated international controversy, that had been written about in dozens of newspapers, that had drawn spectators to the lobby every day of its creation, was hidden behind brown paper for 8 months. Then, on the night of February 10, 1934, quietly, without announcement, workers destroyed it. Pneumatic hammers reduced Rivera's fresco to powder. The act was performed at night. By morning, the wall was bare. The stated reason was practicality. Fresco cannot be moved. The wall had to be used. José María Serre, the Catalan artist who had already contributed to the complex's decorative program, was commissioned to replace Rivera's work with something more suitable. Serre produced murals of considerable technical accomplishment and negligible intellectual risk, depicting the advance of civilization through heroic effort, all rendered in the same sepia tones he favored. They remain on those walls today. Almost nobody goes to look at them. Almost everybody who has heard of Rockefeller Center has heard of the Rivera incident, the destroyed mural, the communist face in the capitalist lobby, the check, the hammers, the night. The most famous wall in the building is the one that no longer exists. What the Rivera incident revealed was not, primarily, Rockefeller's political conservatism. That was already known, easily inferred, hardly surprising. What it revealed was the nature of the commission itself, the limits built into what had appeared to be patronage. Rivera had been invited into the building. He had been given scaffolding and assistance, and $14,000 and the lobby wall of the most prominent new building in America. He had been given, apparently, creative latitude. What he had not been given, what no artist in the program had been given, what the approved brief of New Frontiers and the March of Civilization had made structurally impossible, was the freedom to mean something that the patron had not pre-approved. Art in Rockefeller Center was always permitted within a frame. Rivera's transgression was not political, it was architectural. He attempted to exceed the frame. The building destroyed the attempt and covered the evidence. The Channel Gardens fountain, visible from the street where Rivera's admirers once gathered to watch him work, continued flowing through all of this. The water made no editorial comment. Civic grace, it turned out, was easier to sustain than artistic freedom, because the fountain asked nothing of the people who walked past it, and Rivera had asked everything. The empty wall that Sert eventually covered remains, underneath the sepia murals, the truest surface in the complex, the place where the building showed what it was, not a cultural institution, not a democratic space, a very beautiful, very controlled, very expensive argument. And an argument, as Rivera discovered, that could only be made one way. By the end of 1932, with 3 buildings completed and the complex still rising around them, John D. Rockefeller Jr. faced a problem that the architectural blueprints had never addressed. Who exactly was going to pay rent here? The Metropolitan Opera's withdrawal in 1929 had dissolved the original cultural anchor. The Depression had evaporated the theoretical corporate tenants who were supposed to fill 12 acres of Midtown Manhattan office space. What remained was the lease obligation to Columbia University, $3.25 million annually, every year, regardless of occupancy, and a personal fortune that had been absorbing losses for 3 years without relief. Rockefeller needed a tenant the way a drowning man needs something solid, and what he found was a corporation with its own reasons for wanting a very visible address: the Radio Corporation of America. The arrangement with RCA was more than a lease. It was a rebranding of the entire enterprise. The complex that had been projected variously as a cultural campus, an opera neighborhood, and an office development became, under the RCA relationship, something new: a media city. RCA's broadcast operations required infrastructure that most landlords could not provide: antenna systems, studio space, transmission capacity, the physical plant of a national communications network. Rockefeller Center, still under construction, could be engineered to provide all of it. The National Broadcasting Company, RCA's subsidiary, would occupy studio space in the building that would carry RCA's name. The skyscraper at the center of the complex, 70 stories of Indiana limestone rising above the sunken plaza, became known as the RCA Building, and for 2 generations that name signified something specific: the place where American radio and then American television was made. Real estate manager Hugh Robertson translated Rockefeller's commercial necessity into an operational philosophy. The complex was not, Robertson argued, a collection of office buildings. It was a self-contained urban ecosystem: shops, restaurants, broadcast facilities, entertainment venues, underground connections, a privately maintained street, designed to ensure that money spent inside it stayed inside it. The underground concourse connecting the buildings was not an architectural amenity. It was a commercial retention mechanism. If pedestrians could move between buildings without surfacing to street level, they would spend more time and more money within the complex controlled environment. The Channel Gardens Promenade, flowing from Fifth Avenue toward the sunken plaza and the RCA building's entrance, performed the inverse function. It pulled pedestrians off the public street and into the complex's gravity, a transition from city to controlled city so graceful that most people experienced it as invitation rather than capture. The city within a city slogan that Rockefeller's publicists deployed throughout the 1930s was not hyperbole. It was a precise description of the commercial ambition. The complex had its own electrical plant, its own loading infrastructure, its own internal street, the private road called Rockefeller Plaza, that the owner could and did close to public traffic when circumstances required. Tenants included not only NBC and RCA, but also the offices of British intelligence during the Second World War, the headquarters of Time Incorporated, the Associated Press, and dozens of smaller firms that valued the address as much as the square footage. The complex's first years of full operation generated leasing revenue that eventually absorbed the ground rent obligations, though this took longer than anyone had publicly projected. Rockefeller did not achieve positive cash flow until 1940. 10 years of personal subsidy preceded the first year of genuine return. Radio City Music Hall occupied the southwest corner of the block and served a function in the commercial ecosystem that Robertson understood with unusual clarity. It was a loss leader. The hall seated nearly 6,000 people, the largest indoor theater in the world at its opening, and its operating costs were such that it could not have been made profitable even by full occupancy at premium prices. Robertson and Rockefeller did not expect it to be profitable. They expected it to be famous. A world-famous entertainment venue anchoring the complex would attract foot traffic that benefited every retail tenant, every restaurant, every office building in the immediate vicinity. The music hall was the fountain's larger architectural twin, a civic gesture that was simultaneously a commercial instrument, beautiful enough to justify itself aesthetically while performing economic work that its beauty made invisible. The Channel Gardens, seen from Robertson's perspective, were the finest expression of this logic. 6. rectangular pools arranged along a formal promenade, flanked by seasonal plantings. Terminating at the sunken skating rink with its gold Prometheus above, and the RCA building's limestone mass beyond, the sequence was designed to feel like arrival at something important. It was designed to feel public. It was designed to feel like a gift. None of these feelings were inaccurate. The gift was real. The public welcome was genuine. And the commercial intention behind both was equally real, equally genuine, and architecturally inseparable from the beauty it produced. This is what Robertson understood, and what most critics of corporate public space have struggled to articulate clearly since. The seduction is not false. It is simply funded by something other than generosity. The opening night program for Radio City Music Hall on December 27, 1932, ran to 32 pages and listed a performance that has no surviving admirers. Samuel Roxy Rockefeller, impresario, showman, the man whose name had been synonymous with theatrical spectacle in New York for 2 decades, had conceived of an entertainment that defied easy categorization. There were ballet dancers. There were flying acrobats. There were comedians. There was a symphony orchestra. There were the Roxyettes, the precision dance troupe that Roxy had brought from his previous theater, and that would, under the name the Rockettes, outlast everything else he built. The program lasted 4 hours. The audience was polite in the way that audiences are polite when something is not working. Reviewers were less polite. Within 2 weeks, Roxy's variety format was abandoned. The hall was converted into a movie palace, and the film chosen for its first feature run was Frank Capra's The Bitter Tea of General Yen. The hall that had been designed as the future of live entertainment became almost immediately a very large cinema. What survived this failure, and what has continued to draw visitors to the hall for 90 years, was not Roxy's programming vision but the room itself. Edward Durrell Stone and Donald Deskey had created an interior of such sustained and specific brilliance that it functioned independently of whatever was performed within it. The auditorium's proscenium arch was designed in concentric arcs that drew the eye upward and inward simultaneously, creating a spatial experience that audiences consistently described in religious terms: a secular cathedral, a chapel of American optimism, a place where the scale of the space performed a kind of emotional operation on whoever entered it. Deskey's interior design extended through every surface: custom textiles, custom hardware, custom furniture, a consistency of aesthetic intention that was unprecedented in commercial interior design and has rarely been equaled since. The women's lounges alone, each floor a different designer, each room a complete aesthetic statement, attracted architectural pilgrims who had no intention of seeing whatever was playing on the screen. The audiences who filled Radio City in the 30s and 40s were not primarily the wealthy patrons for whom the complex had been nominally conceived. They were office workers and shop girls and factory employees who dressed carefully for the occasion and experienced, for the price of a movie ticket, an environment of extraordinary beauty. The Art Deco grandeur that surrounded them was not a historical artifact. It was new, it was present. It was an argument addressed directly to them, that they deserved beautiful things, that their leisure time had value, that the culture of aspiration extended to everyone who could afford admission. This was Rockefeller Center's most genuinely democratic achievement, and it happened by accident. The hall that was designed as a showcase for elite entertainment became, Dean West, through the pragmatism of commercial failure, a space where thousands of ordinary New Yorkers experienced their weekly contact with the idea of American excellence. The crash of Roxy's vision produced something more durable than his vision would have been. The philosophical consolation available here, that failure occasionally produces better outcomes than success would have, is, however, somewhat undermined by the mechanism that made it possible. The hall's accessibility was commercial, rather than civic. The beautiful experience it provided was available to those who could pay admission, and unavailable to those who could not. The Art Deco grandeur that surrounded Depression-era audiences was simultaneously a genuine gift and a reminder of where they were in the social architecture. You could sit in a 6,000-seat theater of extraordinary beauty for the price of a film ticket. You could not own any part of what surrounded you. The room belonged to Rockefeller, as the complex belonged to Rockefeller, as the Channel Gardens and the Sunken Plaza and the Gold Prometheus and the formal promenade from Fifth Avenue all belonged to Rockefeller. The gift was real. The ownership was clearer than the gift. And in the dark of the theater, watching the screen, it was almost possible to forget the difference. Lewis Mumford walked through Rockefeller Center in 1938 and wrote about what he found with the measured fury he reserved for things that almost worked. His criticism, published across several essays and eventually synthesized in his longer architectural writing of the 40s, was not that the complex was ugly. He conceded more than once that it was not. His complaint was structural rather than aesthetic, and it has aged better than the admiration of most of his contemporaries. What Rockefeller Center had achieved, Mumford argued, was the perfection of a new urban form. The privately owned public space managed to appear democratic while operating as something more controlled and more exclusive than that appearance suggested. It was architecture of power, he wrote, not of people. And the distinction, though it required some unpacking, was genuine and consequential. The legal situation was, by the 1930s, already well established. Rockefeller Center's plazas, promenades, and gardens were private property. The owner could regulate behavior within them, exclude individuals, restrict uses, close spaces temporarily, and alter the character of the environment at will. The Channel Gardens were maintained, planted, and redesigned according to the owner's preferences, not the public's. The skating rink, which had begun as an improvised attraction in 1936, when workmen left a flooded area of the Sunken Plaza and employees began skating informally, was eventually formalized and commercialized, admission charged, hours set. The gradual transformation of what had appeared to be civic amenity into ticketed experience was not a betrayal of the original design. It was the fulfillment of it. Robertson's commercial ecosystem had always understood public feeling space as a revenue-generating instrument. Mumford's deeper point was about the effect on the city beyond Rockefeller Center's property lines. The complex had established a model of urban development in which the private sector provided public quality amenity, plazas, gardens, pedestrian passages, in exchange for density bonuses, naming rights, and the cultural legitimacy that came from being perceived as civic benefactors. This model was already spreading when Mumford wrote about it, and would spread much further in the decades following. Corporate plazas began appearing across American cities, each one modeled in some degree on what Robertson and Rockefeller had demonstrated, that a privately controlled outdoor space, designed to feel welcoming, could anchor a real estate development, attract tenants and visitors, and generate returns while appearing to offer something for nothing. The form was copied. The fountain was copied. The promenade was copied. The specific quality of Rockefeller Center, the limestone consistency, the art program, the genuine investment in aesthetic experience, was in most cases not copied because it was too expensive and too particular to replicate at the scale and speed that post-war development required. What was replicated was the structure of the argument. We have given you this beautiful space. Therefore, we deserve your goodwill, your tenancy, your commerce, your presence. The gift in most cases was considerably less beautiful than the original. a windswept concrete plaza, a single piece of abstract sculpture that nobody had commissioned with Rivera's seriousness. A few trees and planters. The argument remained the same. The give us credit for the plaza logic that Rockefeller Center had established as a civic norm became the standard justification for private development in American cities for the second half of the 20th century. Mumford saw this coming and wrote about it with his characteristic combination of precision and despair. But his critiques circulated primarily among architects and planners who were already using the Rockefeller Center model as a template. They read Mumford carefully and built the corporate plaza anyway. The class geography of the promenade that Mumford identified in the late 30s was subtle enough to require explanation, and obvious enough, once explained, that it was impossible to unsee. The Channel Gardens walked you from Fifth Avenue, the commercial corridor of luxury retail, toward the RCA building's entrance, passing shop fronts and restaurant terraces, guided by the formal plantings and the gentle slope of the grade toward the sunken plaza. The experience was elegantly calibrated, open to everyone, designed for comfort, and oriented entirely toward consumption. You could sit in the Channel Gardens and spend nothing. The architecture did not prohibit this. It simply made the alternative. Moving along the promenade, entering the buildings, spending money in the shops and restaurants, so pleasant, so natural, so beautifully invited, that resistance required a deliberate act of will that the design made to feel like ingratitude. The civic welcome and the commercial seduction occupied exactly the same physical space. To walk through one was to walk through the other. Mumford's phrase, architecture of power, not of people, requires one qualification that he did not make explicitly, possibly because it would have complicated his argument more than he wanted. The architecture was also genuinely beautiful, and the beauty was not incidental to the power. It was constitutive of it. A less beautiful version of Rockefeller Center would have been a less effective instrument of the ideology it embodied. The limestone, the Prometheus, the Channel Gardens, the 6,000 seats of Radio City, these were not ornaments on a commercial structure. They were the commercial structure, operating through aesthetic experience rather than despite it. The fountain seduces because it is genuinely lovely. This is the detail that Mumford's moral framework struggled to accommodate. And that every critic of corporate public space has struggled with since. The lie is beautiful, and the beauty is not a lie. The ice rink was installed in 1936 as a temporary experiment. It returned every winter after that, which is how most things at Rockefeller Center became permanent, not by intention, but by repetition, not by design, but by the slow accumulation of habit. By the late 1940s, the complex had already outlived the precise historical moment that made it meaningful. The war was over. The Depression was mythology. The men who had built the place were aging, and the ideology embedded in every limestone cornice. That private capital could perform public generosity, that one family's ambition could be redeemed as civic art, had grown quieter, less urgent, harder to argue with any conviction. The buildings remained. The argument had moved on. Lawrence Rockefeller was not his father. This is not a criticism. It is a structural fact about inheritance. John D. Rockefeller Jr. had built the complex as an act of almost pathological self-definition, pouring personal fortune into poured concrete because retreat was psychologically unthinkable. Lawrence inherited something different, not a project, but a property, not a vision, but a liability. The Columbia University ground lease, renegotiated across the decades, remained the foundational obligation, a fixed annual cost that had made sense when the complex was rising and made considerably less sense when the post-war real estate market began reshuffling the geography of American ambition. The financial reviews conducted by the Rockefeller estate in 1948 tell a story of institutional inertia. A complex generating income, certainly, but income chained to obligations that originated in a different economic universe, negotiated under duress, in a depression that had reshaped what ambition meant and what it cost. Television was the first genuine disruption. NBC had anchored the complex since the early 1930s, its radio operations filling the upper floors of 30. Rockefeller Plaza, with the low electrical hum of broadcast civilization. Radio was what the building had been built around. RCA's dominance in the medium was the commercial logic that gave the entire enterprise its tenant gravity. But television rewired everything. The technology NBC had been quietly developing since the late 1930s exploded into American domestic life after the war, and the studios at 30 Rock adapted, converted, rebuilt. What had been radio control rooms became television production suites. What had been an empire of sound became an empire of image. The transition looked like continuity from the outside. NBC remained. The building remained. The sign above the elevator banks remained. But the cultural logic had shifted entirely. RCA, the naming rights patron whose initials had christened the main tower, was already beginning the long commercial contraction that would eventually reduce it to a brand sold and resold like furniture from a dissolved estate. The building wore the old name while the institution it commemorated slowly diminished behind the facade. Cold War America developed a complicated relationship with monumental architecture, the same verticality that had signified optimism in 1930. The skyscraper as proof that human ambition was still productive, still upward directed, began to carry different freight in the nuclear age. Soviet architecture had claimed monumentalism for state power. American corporate architecture responded by becoming simultaneously larger and blander, asserting scale while retreating from ornament, as though grandeur itself had become ideologically suspect. Rockefeller Center occupied an awkward position in this cultural shift. It was too Art Deco to be modern, too ornate to be neutral, too associated with a specific family's specific ambition to function as the anonymous corporate backdrop that post-war commercial aesthetics preferred. It survived this period not by reinventing itself, but by becoming something it had never quite been designed to be, a landmark. Landmarks are buildings that have outlived their arguments. They are preserved not because their original logic still compels, but because their physical presence has accumulated enough associative weight, enough Christmases, enough photographs, enough first-date memories and tourist pilgrimages to make demolition feel like vandalism rather than progress. Rockefeller Center became neutral by becoming beloved. It survived by becoming scenery. The Channel Gardens fountains continued to flow through all of this, or rather, they flowed seasonally, drained and refilled, according to maintenance schedules that had nothing to do with the civic aspirations Raymond Hood had sketched into the original promenade design. Hood had imagined the fountain channel as democratic breathing space, a European gesture of public grace inserted into the compressed grid of Midtown. By the 1950s, it was a pleasant walkway between shops. By the 1960s, it was a tourist corridor leading to the skating rink. The water moved. The meaning had been quietly replaced by something more useful. Atmosphere. Atmosphere is meaning, with the edges sanded off, made comfortable, made consumable. The fountains were still beautiful. They had simply stopped being true. The front page of the New York Times on October 31st, 1989, carried a headline that managed to be simultaneously factual and hysterical. Rockefeller Center, the monument built to embody American permanence, had been sold, 80% of it, to Mitsubishi Estate Company of Japan. The price was approximately $860 million. The reaction was approximately priceless. Politicians made speeches. Columnists reached for metaphors. A radio host in New Jersey asked his listeners whether they felt safer knowing that the building whose name was synonymous with American ambition was now, technically, a Japanese asset. The listeners, apparently, did not feel safer. The building, for its part, continued to stand on the same 12 acres it had occupied since 1931, indifferent to the nationality of its shareholders in the way that limestone generally is. The sale was not a surprise to anyone who had been paying attention to the Rockefeller Group's finances. The family had been managing the complex as a real estate holding company since the 1970s, gradually consolidating ownership and attempting to rationalize the cost structure that Junior's original Depression-era desperation had locked into the Columbia lease. The lease itself, renegotiated, extended, restructured, remained the gravitational center of the enterprise's financial problems. Ground rent on a 12-acre Midtown Manhattan site was not a small number in any era. In the leveraged real estate environment of the 1980s, when debt financing had become the primary vocabulary of commercial property, it was crushing. The Rockefeller Group had borrowed heavily against the complex's value during the decade's speculative boom. When the commercial real estate market contracted sharply in the late 80s, a contraction that was less a correction than a reckoning, the group's debt load became unserviceable. The sale to Mitsubishi was not a triumph of globalism or a defeat of American nationalism. It was a margin call wearing an ideologically charged costume. Mitsubishi's acquisition coincided almost perfectly with the peak of Japanese commercial real estate speculation, a bubble inflated by the same mechanisms: cheap credit, asset price feedback loops, institutional overconfidence, that have destroyed financial systems in every era and every language. The Rockefeller Center purchase was among the most visible of Japan's American trophy acquisitions, which meant it was among the most visible of the casualties when the bubble collapsed. By 1995, Mitsubishi Estate had filed for bankruptcy protection on its Rockefeller Center holdings, writing down nearly $1 billion in losses on an investment that had seemed, 6 years earlier, to represent the confident reach of Japanese capital into the symbolic heart of American commerce. The complex reverted to its creditors. It was subsequently restructured, partially sold, and eventually acquired in 2000 by Tishman Speyer Properties, which consolidated the asset, stabilized the finances, and removed the saga from the front pages by the reliable method of making it boring again. What the Mitsubishi episode revealed, or should have revealed, had anyone been paying the right kind of attention, was something fundamental about monumental architecture and the illusions it sustains. Rockefeller Center had been built as a declaration of permanence. Junior had insisted on limestone because it aged well, had mandated quality of construction because he intended the buildings to stand for centuries, had spoken publicly about the complex as a contribution to New York that would outlast any individual ownership structure. All of this was true, and none of it was relevant to the financial mechanics that governed the complex's actual existence. The limestone was permanent. The ownership structure was as contingent and fragile as any other leveraged commercial arrangement. The building declared permanence, while the entity that owned it cycled through crisis, restructuring, and transfer with the regularity of a poorly managed fund. The Channel Gardens fountains were photographed by Japanese tourists during the Mitsubishi years, as they had been photographed by American tourists in every previous decade. The water did not change nationality. It reflected whatever sky was above it, gray in November, brilliant in June, and continued its low, unhurried movement toward the sunken plaza, where Prometheus held his stolen fire above the ice rink. Prometheus, Paul Manship's gilded figure, had been commissioned to embody the spirit of human aspiration, the theft of divine power in service of mortal civilization. By 1989, he was primarily a backdrop for engagement photographs and Christmas card compositions. He held his fire above the skaters, regardless of who owned the building behind him. This is what monuments do when they have outlived their arguments. They become settings. They provide the appearance of meaning without requiring anyone to engage with the meaning's actual content. Prometheus still reaches. Nobody is required to ask toward what. The impermanence did not announce itself. It arrived, as it always does, through the ordinary mechanics of debt and interest rates and market cycles, dressed in the language of acquisition and restructuring and controlled transition. The building built to declare that American capital was permanent discovered, in the ordinary course of events, that nothing built by capital is permanent. Only the limestone, and only for a while. The threat came not from neglect, but from progress, which is how the most dangerous threats to beautiful things usually arrive. In 1978, the owners of Radio City Music Hall announced that the venue was losing money, which it had been doing intermittently and sometimes catastrophically since its disastrous opening night in December 1932, and that demolition was under active consideration. The announcement was made with the particular corporate tone that presents destruction as reluctant practicality, as though the decision to erase 46 years of architectural achievement was being made against the better instincts of sensitive businessmen who simply had no choice. The hall was not profitable. The hall was occupying prime midtown real estate. The calculation appeared straightforward to everyone who had not been inside the room. The interior of Radio City Music Hall is not straightforward. Donald Deskey's design, executed with obsessive precision in the early 1930s under the patronage of Samuel Rockefeller, who did not live to see the room become what it became, represents one of the complete statements of Art Deco interior design in the world. The Great Hall itself, with its sweeping arc of ceiling rising in concentric curves above the orchestra, creates the sensation of sitting inside a wave at the precise moment before it breaks. The lobbies contain murals and metalwork and carpet designs of such accumulated richness that the room functions less as a theater than as an argument that human beings deserve beautiful spaces in which to gather, that the quality of a room's surfaces communicates something about the value assigned to the people inside it. Rockefeller had believed this with the fervor of a man who had grown up without beautiful rooms and had never recovered from the discovery that they were possible. Deskey had executed the belief in aluminum and glass and lacquered wood. The room made the argument physical. The New York City Landmarks Preservation Commission had been established in 1965 in the aftermath of the demolition of Pennsylvania Station, a catastrophe so culturally traumatic that it effectively invented the modern American preservation movement by demonstrating, in rubble, what the absence of legal protection meant in practice. The Commission had the power to designate buildings and interiors as landmarks, preventing demolition or significant alteration without review. Radio City's exterior was part of the Rockefeller Center complex and carried its own protections. The interior was a separate question, and it was the interior, Deskey's extraordinary room, that the owners proposed to eliminate. The preservation battle that followed lasted several years and involved the Commission, the state government, and a coalition of architects, performers, and ordinary New Yorkers who had sat in that curved hall and understood, at the level of physical experience rather than architectural argument, that something irreplaceable was at stake. The hall was designated a New York City interior landmark in 1978. The designation was not automatic or uncontested. The owners argued that landmark protection constituted an unconstitutional taking of property rights, a legal theory that has been advanced against preservation law in every decade since preservation law existed. The Commission held. The room survived. It was subsequently restored, reopened, and returned to operation as a performance venue, which it has remained, improbably and genuinely, functioning as a working theater in a city that has demolished most of its architectural contemporaries. The irony embedded in this outcome is not small. The most beloved interior in Rockefeller Center, the room that generates the most genuine emotional attachment from the most people, was a commercial failure from its first night of operation. Rockefeller's original vision, a variety program of enormous ambition and larger pretension, collapsed within weeks. The hall survived by pivoting to film, then pivoted again through decades of reinvention, its architectural integrity preserved, while its programmatic identity shifted continuously. The room that was saved by landmark designation was saved precisely because it had failed to be what its creator intended. Its survival depended on the gap between its original purpose and the purposes that accumulated around it over time. The Christmases and concerts and graduations and performances that left no physical mark on Desky's aluminum and lacquer, but created collectively a constituency for the room's continuation that no financial argument could simply overrule. The Channel Gardens fountains were restored during the broader Rockefeller Center renovations of the 1980s, cleaned and repointed, and returned to operation with the careful attention to surface that characterizes institutional preservation. The restoration was genuine and technically accomplished. What it could not restore was the specific historical consciousness that had surrounded the fountain's original installation. Hood's democratic ambition, the Depression-era context that made a public promenade feel like an act of grace rather than commercial strategy. The water returned. The memory did not. This is the honest account of what preservation does and does not accomplish. It maintains the physical evidence of a past moment, without maintaining the past moment's meaning. The fountains flow in the present tense. Their original argument is available only in archives, in sketches, in the kind of attention that most people passing through on their way to the skating rink have neither the time nor the reason to bring. We preserve the shell. We cannot preserve the soul. Landmark status is a photograph of a living thing, accurate, detailed, and permanently still. The planners came first, before the lawyers or the journalists or the tourists. They came with notebooks and site visits and a conviction that Rockefeller Center had solved something, that the complex at 6th Avenue and 50th Street had discovered the formula for making cities feel generous without costing the owner anything genuinely irreplaceable. Boston's Prudential Center, completed in 1965, borrowed the setback plaza and the tower above podium geometry without borrowing the Channel Gardens. Montreal's Place Ville Marie, finished in 1962, took the underground concourse logic and ran it beneath an entire city block. Chicago, Houston, Atlanta. Each built its version of the Rockefeller lesson. Each missed the same detail. What they copied was the form. What they left out was the fountain. This is not a small omission. The Channel Gardens at Rockefeller Center are not decorative. They are structural. Not in the engineering sense, but in the civic one. They exist as the pause before the commercial interior, the moment of softness before the building's economic demand begins. Every corporate plaza, built in the post-war decades, understood the plaza as threshold. Few understood it as gift. The distinction is invisible until you stand in both spaces and feel the difference. One plaza makes you feel observed, the other makes you feel, briefly, permitted. Rockefeller Center's imitators built permission structures that felt like waiting rooms. The form without the fountain is architecture with the conscience removed. Urban planners writing in the 1970s cited Rockefeller Center in proposals for mixed-use development across North America with a frequency that became its own kind of distortion. The citations accumulated until the original was less a building than a category. Rockefeller style, meaning tall tower, retail podium, public adjacent open space. The phrase drifted so far from its source that planners who had never visited the complex were designing in its image. Influence at that distance becomes rumor. And cities built on rumor are cities built on a misreading of someone else's anxiety, translated once too many times, until the original terror that drove the thing into existence has been laundered into planning doctrine. Rockefeller built his complex because he could not afford to stop. His imitators built theirs because they believed he had chosen to begin. In 1960, John D. Rockefeller Jr. wrote a letter to his son Lawrence, in which he described the complex in a phrase that has been quoted selectively ever since. The full sentence reads, "I had no choice but to go forward. And I believe now, as I believed then, that going forward was the only honest thing I could do." Commentators have emphasized the resolve. What the sentence actually contains is something stranger. The confession that resolve and compulsion were, for this man, indistinguishable. He had no choice. He went forward. And he retroactively named that compulsion honesty. This is the most revealing document in the Rockefeller Center archive, more revealing than the leasing contracts or the demolition logs or the correspondence about Rivera's mural. It shows a man who built one of the 20th century's most significant architectural achievements, not from vision, but from the impossibility of retreat. The Metropolitan Opera left. The Depression arrived. The ground. Lease held. The man who could not afford to fail, financially, psychologically, dynastically, built a city block rather than admit that the project had become untenable. What emerged from that refusal was, against every reasonable expectation, genuinely great. Rockefeller Center is beautiful. It is generous in its better moments. It earns its landmark designation and its place in the visual memory of New York with something approaching legitimacy. And yet, the title's question was never fully answered because the most honest answer is not a simple one. It should never have been built because nothing that achieves this scale of consequence should depend on one man's terror of his own failure. That is too fragile a foundation for something this permanent. That it worked, that the terror produced beauty, that the compulsion produced grace, that the refusal to retreat produced a fountain in the middle of Midtown that people have stood beside for 9 decades without knowing why. It moves them, does not redeem the logic that built it. It only proves that human beings are capable of making things greater than their reasons. What remains now is limestone and ledger entries. The foundations are there, beneath the fountain, beneath the concourse, beneath the skating rink and the holiday crowds, and the television broadcast windows. Photographs in the municipal archives show the site before demolition. Ordinary buildings on ordinary streets, storefronts with hand-lettered signs, fire escapes descending toward sidewalks that no longer exist in that configuration. In those photographs, nothing announces its own impermanence. The buildings look solid. The streets look permanent. Then the next photograph shows the same block empty, scraped back to earth, and what seemed solid turns out to have been entirely provisional. The fragments that survive demolition are held in various collections. Hood's sketches are preserved. The Rivera mural is not. It exists only in a single black and white photograph taken by a Rockefeller employee before the plaster was destroyed. The image slightly overexposed at the edges. Lenin's face visible, but blurred by light. Radio City's interior survived its near demolition and sits now inside a landmark designation, beautiful and maintained. The context of its original failure safely dissolved by decades of successful use. The Channel Gardens fountains were restored in the 1990s, the reflecting pools cleaned, the bronze seahorse fixtures repaired. He built it to be remembered. We remember it, but not always him. The fountain moves through all 4 seasons, filling and emptying and filling again, indifferent to origin, indifferent to legacy, continuous in the way that water is continuous, not because it persists, but because it does not require a reason to.